Welcome. We are so excited to present to you CARE's 4-part Anti-Racist Educator web series. In order to reach our goal of an anti-racist educator in every classroom, we need to be able to talk. So we invited 16 different educators from around the country to discuss what it means to be an anti-racist educator. Our hope is that you will be inspired to have similar conversations in your own communities. We even created discussion guides to help. Let's get started. We firmly believe educators should work in community, especially in our anti-racism efforts. We'll talk about community and how to build your own during this episode. I'm joined by another 4 phenomenal guests. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Soonling Blackburn, Professional Development Manager for Learning for Justice, always representing Mississippi. James Ford, Executive Director for the Center for Racial Equity in Education in North Carolina. Christy Knoll, the 6th grade teacher from Vermont. And Daniela Suarez-Boyd, a high school math teacher and instructional coach from Florida. I'm Val Brown, Principal Academic Officer for CARE. I'm so ready for this conversation. Let's get started. We are here with our panelists tonight to have a conversation about gathering your anti-racist and not so anti-racist colleagues. So really, this is a conversation about how to work with other people in your school community when it comes to doing anti-racist education work. So I'm just going to get started. Have you all worked in isolation as anti-racist educators? Can you talk a little bit about that or finding community in this space? Who would like to start?
I have found myself in a lot of isolation lately. A lot of that, of course, is due to the nature of this school year and just how it began. So here in South Florida, our schools basically have been open since school started. But school's not the same, right? Our interactions are not the same. The relationships that we used to hold with our colleagues and even with our students are not the same. But I think this year more than ever, I have felt like I am working in isolation simply because this summer, right, there was a lot of talk, a lot of conversation, especially like in my district and in my school about what changes we were going to make and all these equity initiatives and how we were going to push equity at the forefront and have these conversations. And this entire year has felt very performative. It has felt very much like a checklist. It has felt very safe. And we know that when we are trying to be an anti-racist educator and encourage other educators to be anti-racist educators, that playing it safe is not the way to go, that these conversations need to be bold. These conversations need to be fierce, unapologetic, and uncomfortable in order for true change to happen.
Yeah, I would have to say, if you asked me that question 2-3 years ago, the answer would have been absolutely. In North Carolina, I gotta say, I've been really fortunate to not feel as isolated because we've built community here. There are so many folks, so many moving pieces that we're introducing this language, this work, and doing it kind of compartmentalized. And what's happened is, I can probably say that I think some momentum has gotten built. But to be clear, like, we were doing this work before it became popular, right? Before it was in vogue, before there was a resurgence of Black lives and an increased focus on racial equity or terrorist attacks that deliberately focused in on folks of color. We were already calling for justice in the school system. And so there are players who are strewn about the state, and North Carolina's big, but we've been able to build community with each other. And I really consider ourselves fortunate in that regard, that we no longer feel that sense of longing, that sense of isolation that we maybe felt 2 or 3 years ago, because we've decided to, lock arms and be in solidarity with folks who really understand and do this work, who do for the right reasons, and have, who are worth their weight in salt.
I really relate to what you said, James, here in Mississippi. Sometimes I go to national conferences about equity or anti-racism, and I run into people who are like, how can you live in Mississippi? It's so racist there. And it always really hits me the wrong way because, yeah, that's true. And also, alongside that, there has been this long-standing historical resistance that is here that, we are just the next, group, generation, whatever, linking arms with people who've been doing this work for a very long time, and that is meaningful. But for myself, even with all of that, personally, I still feel that isolation oftentimes because of my own identity, my own racial background, being an Asian identifying person in a state that is characterized as being kind of in this black and white racial binary, really makes it hard sometimes because I don't believe we can do good, meaningful anti-racist work unless we are also understanding ourselves, feeling ourselves nourished and cared for in spaces.
I was really fortunate when I joined the faculty at Tuttle Middle School in South Burlington that we had at that time an incredible administrator, colleague, friend, mentor named Paul Yoon, who is just a phenomenal, active anti-racist in our state, who is now leading incredible efforts at the local university. But at the time, I was coming in as my first year in a new middle school and working for an administrator who I knew understood this work and was a leader in the work, and that gave me an incredible amount of confidence and bravery to come into my classroom ready to go. And because of that, though, I will say that I made some assumptions about where our school and district might be that were not necessarily accurate. And so I found myself coming in and moving at a pace that ended up creating isolation, because I had imagined or anticipated that the work might be in a different place. And so I've since learned from that experience a bit, not to slow down my own process, but to really consider what it looks like to join in partnership with others, in particular in partnership with other educators, in a way that really welcomes folks into the work and then doesn't isolate me, and hopefully also doesn't further splinter the work and push folks away. And I think to add to that, something that feels really important is that from the beginning, it felt like my students and their families were my co-conspirators in this work. And so there have been moments and times when I have felt isolated in my district, in my state, and in the field of education, but I haven't felt isolated when working alongside our students and alongside their families.
You all alluded to this in your first answers, but can you talk about the importance of community in anti-racist work?
So something that Christy said really resonates with me in that our students are like our co-conspirators and they're part of our community as well. Like, I don't know where I would be without my kids, in all honesty. And this year, like, we've been having such critical conversations, and I feel so nourished every single time. And the other thing I would say, in order to build community, because I have felt so isolated this year, one thing that has definitely helped is our Twitter, to connect to other educators. And I know that a lot of us are connected in the virtual professional learning networks and whatnot. But I have been able to connect with educators across my county, across my district, via Twitter, and have these conversations like on the side, because if our schools aren't having these conversations and our district is not having these conversations, we still need to find a way to have these conversations and encourage each other and motivate this work and to support one another, because this work is difficult, because this work is long haul.
Can I just co-sign that real quick and just give a +1 to social media? I feel like that meme, that GIF where it's that guy said, "Look at us, look at us. Who would have thought? Who would have thought?" Literally, Val, we met all probably 3 times, but I feel like you're my sister. Why? Because we have connected for a number of years now, right? Professionally, like the development we were seeking, whether we were in the classroom or whether we were doing this work of anti-racism, was found in this space, right? This dangerous space, if we're being honest, called the internet, right? And called Twitter. Them Twitter streets are real, but at the same time, there's a lot of heads out there, a lot of people who help grow you, challenge you, develop your knowledge level. And so I look at all of us and I think the exact same thing. Like, Chrissy, this is my first time seeing you for real, but it's like, oh yeah, I know that. Chrissy, yeah, I know Chris. So the community built on the internet cannot be understated. In addition to that, in our organization, Creed, we utilize the internet to kind of aggregate other players throughout the state who, you know, were interested in this work but didn't have a place to go, didn't have a place to interact or sharpen each other, right? And that led to us like kind of building coalition on the ground with other people. So literally like turning our direction toward education stakeholders, like the parents, the teachers, and the students, and saying like, all right, like there's the education outlook on this, but then it's like for the stakeholders, like what do y'all want for education? Like what do you want, right? So building community through coalition building at the state level has been our approach, so that it's not just educators, but it's also like the parents, the students who literally are part of the education community, are recipients of of the service that we're charged with delivering, and being locked in tandem and building a social movement, right?
I am thinking back to something that author, activist, educator Carla Shalaby said in a conversation about the need for community. When asked, she responded, "You need at least 3. You cannot go it alone." And I think as we've been describing, who those 3 are can depend on your situation. It could be other educators, it could be students, it could be family, it could be members of coalition. So as a white person in this work, I often am asking myself, who am I accountable to? And, you know, my first answer is certainly my students and their families. And also I look back to the members of that coalition to really kind of find my compass point and figure out, am I truly heading in the right direction? One of the other things that comes up for me when thinking about this work is how often white supremacy culture has white folks like myself thinking about being like the individual, like I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to go it alone, I can do this. And how easily that can slide into white savior complex, how easily that can reinforce individual systems instead of collective, and how easily that can just slide right back into status quo. And so for me, being in community together with others in this work is essential to make sure that I'm really doing the work of disrupting systems and transforming systems. And that it also includes thinking about the work I'm doing with myself to disrupt those systems within myself and then within my classroom as well.
I've been thinking about how important it's been for me to both have really diverse communities, diverse in terms of race, but also in terms of gender, social class, education background, position, you know, in a community or in a context. And because that richness of perspective matters, so having a diverse community really allows me to see, wow, these are perspectives I had never considered myself, because I can only see the world through my lived experiences, through my lenses. But at the same time, it's also been really important to have community that does mirror my lived experiences, my background, because, you know, I already talked about the isolation that comes with place from where I live, but there are lots of other ways that exists as well. This past couple weeks have been really, really tough in the Asian American community. And if I didn't already have connections to other people, other AAPI people, but specifically other Asian American women, it would have been much harder, because the things that have really been healing recently have been the conversations I've gotten to have with other people who are feeling it really similar to how I'm feeling it, and not having to spend the time explaining necessarily, and not having to do all the educating. And that has, you know, at the same time, we are also educators. So I'm also getting a lot of requests saying, hey, can you come and talk? Can you come and educate? And I want to do it. Like, if people are listening, I hate that this is why, but if people are listening, I want to go and do that and help in whatever way I can. But I would not have any of the emotional, mental, whatever capacity to give into others if I didn't already have my people like here with me and feel that, you know, we together have collective strength, collective power, and that has been so hugely helpful.
How have you tried connecting with educators who are at different levels of readiness and willingness to engage in anti-racism work? What is that like? What do you do? What words of advice do you have for folks who are trying to do that work?
So I'll tell a quick anecdote, which we can use or not use. I walked into a school once, and the title of the workshop, so I had never been there before. The title of the workshop was like Social Justice Teaching 101. And at the beginning, we would have people write down kind of what they were expecting out of the day, just to get a sense of the room, because I do believe you have to really understand your audience. I got these back, and most people were like, I'm really looking for language I can use, or I'm really looking for actionable steps that I can take in my practice to improve. And then I had ones that were, I really hope that you keep your far left-wing propaganda out of here. So I go through the day, and this day is pretty straightforward. We talk about what this looks like in practice. How do we, in our instruction, in the culture we create in our classrooms, make sure that we have representation for all students. Make sure that all students feel safe, feel belonging, all of that. We talked about what this can look like, what are some things we can do, initial practices, how do we improve on what we're already doing, etc. So at the end of the day, this person comes up to me and identifies himself as somebody who had written one of those statements on the paper at the beginning of the day. And he said to me, and I quote, that wasn't that bad. And honestly, that was the best feedback I've ever gotten, because what I realized was when we actually broke it down to what do we mean by these things, what does it look like, it's pretty hard to argue against. I want kids to feel safe at school. I want kids to feel belonging at school. All of that takes away some of the rhetoric that I think has been spun up for good and bad reasons with the work that we do. I'm not saying that works for everyone, kind of opening the door, right? Like this person needed to be willing to at least sit and listen a little bit with an open mind. But what it made me be much more intentional about in my practice is just generally being really clear and really specific with the language that I use, and always bringing it back to the experience of students. Because I think that as educators is where we can find the most common ground. I think we're going to have a lot more people who are like, what, actually, that's not that bad. Maybe there's something to this. And that is a baby step. But we got to get to the baby steps, because the baby steps can add up over time.
One of the things that has me thinking about is where folks are in their journeys. And a wonderful friend and mentor of mine, Shandine Garcia, in a moment of my own exasperation, mentioned to me that I should walk in the direction of people walking toward me. And I think that what she was noticing was that I was pouring energy into folks who were actively resisting the work. And a big reason for that was because I felt accountable. I felt as though they have kids in their classrooms. It is my role. As white folks, I think we're regularly told, go collect your people. And I get that. And I also have come to understand over time that capacity is limited. And where do I spend my energy for greatest result? And so in that moment, what I found was Shandine's wisdom was really permission granting to start spending my energy and investment in educators who were willing to move alongside me in the journey, versus those who were only potentially ever going to be moving farther and farther away and really depleting what resources I had, which then left me exhausted and unable to be my best self with my students in my classroom and in my school.
Who would like to connect to Christy? And also, I want you all to think, are there people in the middle? Is that a thing? Just love to hear your thoughts.
From what I have heard, most people think that by not being actively racist, that you are doing just fine. And those are the people that we really want to impact as anti-racist educators who try to model what it truly is to be an anti-racist educator, to build an environment that supports students across all walks of life, but that is actively anti-racist. And so that I feel like is where I try and spend the majority of my time is kind of hearing those people out, right? So, asking questions without assumptions, and also connecting to my personal experiences when it makes sense. Like, I grew up in a conservative South American immigrant household, and there were a lot of things that I had to unlearn or that I didn't know were damaging messages that were given to me, that I listened to and that I internalized, I guess you could say, for many years, until I was confronted with my own whiteness, with my own privilege and my own naivete. So there are ways that I try to find to connect to those educators that are kind of in the middle, and see if they're willing to engage, right? Because some are not. And something that Christy said really resonated with me, especially lately, our energy, our time, our effort is just so precious, especially in this day and age, in this year. And a lot of that, just because it is my community that I need to call in, I do focus on white Latinx folks, because there's a lot of anti-Blackness, anti-Asian sentiment and so forth in the Latinx community. And that is my community. So it is my responsibility directly to challenge assumptions and to challenge educators that identify similarly to how I do, and then start from there, building coalition and building, hopefully, more future anti-racist educators.
Val, can I jump in? This I have a tattoo. I think this is probably, for me, the most profitable portion of this conversation. I have really tried to argue and ground the work of anti-racism not from a partisan, which you're right, Sarah, is often what people mean when they say political. And so when I anchor that, I try to rob the partisan nature and say, no, it's about democratic humanism. This is about shared power, right? Everybody, no matter who you are, have an equal share in this enterprise. And it's about humanism, people making their full development as human beings. But in addition to that, y'all, I'll be honest. The point at which I detected it's bad faith, then I engage in defense of the work, right? And that's something I think we need to be a little more forthright. We got to be able to stand up when it's clear that folks ain't on our side, or that they have a mission, and that they're on the attack. We need to be able to defend ourselves. Say, no, actually, this is what this is about, right? And if you want to engage, right, you want to call this, anti-American, hateful, this, that, and the third, then let's debate that. But we're gonna do it on the merit of our arguments and on the basis of facts. We're not gonna engage in name calling and what have you, because I feel like people are kind of taking advantage of the perception, right, that we're just out here, we're nice folk. We all believe this stuff, right? And it's it is a matter of morality. Right, when we're talking about kids being able to make full human development, this ain't about what your party identification is, right? This is something that we think should be made available to everybody else.
To me, what you're talking about, James, really speaks to the students as co-conspirators, in that, in my experience, adults often have constructed this wall over time, especially white adults. And I find that for my students, those walls aren't yet that thick. They're still porous enough that they're willing to engage in conversation and have their minds changed when presented with the truth, when given our true history, when given the facts of what's happening in our world today, when being allowed to confront current events and not feel shielded from what's happening, and then when given the space to have an honest conversation together. And when we as educators can create the containers for those conversations, to me, that's a beautiful thing, because we can then hopefully avoid the creation of those adults with these big, deeply built walls that it really takes time to deconstruct. And for myself, at least, the deconstruction of that wall is so filled with my own shame around where I haven't been in the journey and how long it took me to get here. And so much of the work that I hope to do with my students is to ensure that they're not later in their lives going on that deconstructive journey and recognizing all of the time that they've lost to be able to build authentic relationships, to be able to live in a way that is more humane and more just. And I think there is so much for white folks around the way we dehumanize ourselves when we dehumanize others.
And something along those lines as well, these conversations are hard to have, and they do take a lot of our energy, and oftentimes it's easier to walk away at a certain point than to engage. But if we don't have these conversations, then, internalized oppression is just so real in BIPOC also. If these conversations are not had, if these ideas are not explored, if the adults having these conversations are not empowering students and are not fully prepared, kind of like what you said, James, like hitting them with the facts, like you got to know the facts, then even our BIPOC students can become the oppressors. And that is a scary thought. I need to do the work within me myself first in order to meet my students where they are and make sure that they do not internalize that oppression to the point where they themselves become the oppressors.
And, in the case of Asian Americans, that is these like dual competing stereotypes of both yellow peril and the model minority myth, which like don't make sense with each other, but also both exist at the same time. And I was thinking about that in terms of Asian educators who I've been talking to recently and for a while now, because it kind of breaks my heart. I often will hear, I talk a lot with affinity groups of Asian educators, and inevitably there will be somebody in the group who asks, are we even people of color? And I think that is because of these stereotypes, these historic erasures that we don't know. We often don't know the histories, the stories, the experiences, both of longstanding hatred and discrimination, but also of longstanding resistance that exist. And, back to what Daniela was saying about like gathering our own people and helping us see ourselves, and recognizing that oftentimes when we do erase ourselves from a conversation, we just perpetuate the status quo. And the status quo is white supremacist, the status quo is anti-Black, and those things continue to go on within our own communities. And that is something that I've been wrestling with a lot, especially these past couple weeks. Christy said, how do we put the truth in front of them when their walls are porous? That is such a great metaphor. Because I think then if we see ourselves in each other across all of these different lines of difference and experience and blah, 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 all of that, then the phrases that we say all the time, our liberation is bound up with one another, those become not just like nice phrases, those become real. And that is when I think we actually bring people in towards action.
We know the term woke. And we know that there are people who have assumptions about people who they consider woke. Is there something that we need to do as anti-racist educators who are public and active in this space and calling people in and calling people out? Are there things that we need to do to make sure that we are being open to folks wherever they are on their journey? Because I don't want it to become we reduce our values or our purpose or, like we cut back on our mission. And I know that sometimes it's a barrier for folks who are trying to get in, to trying to understand. So just love your thoughts and we can just grapple with it for a little bit.
So one is I just want to acknowledge what Sarah just said. And so yes, not only is there something we can do so that we don't fall into the narrative of wokeness, but it's acknowledging that we ain't reached the summit either. Okay? And I want to talk about Black folks here, right? So that's who I know, right? Just being Black in and of itself does not give one a critical consciousness. There's work we have to do, right? You got some experiential knowledge in most cases, but to deeply understand the histories and how these things operate, that stuff takes effort. And so all of us have our entry points, so that's one thing we can do. The other thing is being intellectually honest and curious. And that's being willing to hear opposing arguments. Like literally engage that, make sure your stuff is sound, make sure you know what you're talking about and it makes sense. And then often like you can also understand perhaps where folks are coming from, but no matter what we do, there's a way in which terms get plastered onto an effort and they get turned into pejoratives, and those pejoratives become those words that I heard Sarah talking about before. They get lobbed out and their only function is to elicit a response. And so literally everything we do will do that. And so that's just part of the game. We have to continue to engage in earnest with folk to make sure that one, there might be critiques and stuff, in our approach and stuff. And when we mess up, we got to be willing to say, yeah, like, I don't know everything, or maybe I do need to grow in this particular area. Being, I guess, who we want the rest of the world to be, that sounds corny, I think is the best way to kind of bring folks along. If I could use a preaching metaphor here, like the greatest, sermon ever preached was the one never preached, right? It's literally about how we live. It's literally about how we embody the virtues that we're talking about, to let folks know, like, all right, like I may not agree with that cat, but he or she is not so aloof that they can't be reached.
Collective liberation means everybody, including those folks who are actively resisting and aren't showing up and are acting in ways that seem really counter to the type of world that so many folks are trying to radically imagine. Then I think about Carla Shalaby, who says there are no throwaway people. And I think about the incredible work of abolitionist Mariam Kaba, who asks us to really dream of worlds away from carceral punishment, which means away from separating people from society. And so I think, James, when I hear you talking about how it's not just what we do, but it's who we are, I think, what does it really mean to live into that radical vision for the future in which every single person has a place? And now I'm not suggesting that that is without accountability, and I'm not suggesting that it's without a commitment to trying to come together toward a healthy collective, but it does really mean that there are no throwaway people, and it does really mean that we are all in this together.
So, Christy, I've seen you and others do a really good job of modeling this on social media, on Twitter, where you will ask people if they're willing to engage in a conversation. And I think that is just so powerful, especially for me, someone who it's just my emotions, I wear my emotions on my sleeve. It's just so obvious. And it's sometimes that's what makes this work so difficult for me, is just a deep emotional investment that I have. And seeing you and others just model that for me is just so impactful for me as to where I want to be, and what I can do as well, so that I just don't leave a conversation there, or that I don't at least try and engage and see what others within my own community, and maybe even outside of my community, might be thinking.
It is helpful and important to recognize that there is not just one way of going about this work, even though we might all have a shared vision for what this work will achieve in the end. That we all have our different roles, our different positions that we play, and that also there's nuance in when we do and don't choose to expend certain types of energy, or hear things, especially if we are target in a moment, right? When we take that or don't, like there are things that I will tolerate in a workshop and try to educate and question and really dig into, that if I hear the same thing on the street, I'm just going to turn around and walk the other way, because I'm an educator. So I like make that covenant to myself when I enter an educational space that I'm willing to expend that energy, because I do believe that, everyone can and will eventually, want to do the right thing. I have to have that belief in order to do this work well. And at the same time, like if I'm just walking down the street trying to get like a smoothie or something, I don't need to hear you, throw out a racial slur or whatever and be like, what do you mean by that? Can you tell me more? Because I really just want to drink my smoothie so that I can energize for the next time I'm in a workshop and somebody says that thing. So I think we also do have to recognize our own humanity as well, that part of that is that imperfection, is that, we're not all the way there ourselves. And also we have finite resources, energies, whatever, that sometimes we're making choices based on the position that we play in this fight, which is as educators specifically, that, that is where we have the most impact, that is where we hold power. And so we're going to use that position with all of our energy, and then hold the rest with love and care and safety for ourselves and for each other, so that this work can go as far forward as we can.
Such an honor to share my community with you all. We need each other. Find your community and bring them with you next time. Thanks for being here.